This is the brand new ROG Phone 7 Ultimate. It's $1,400. It's the fastest, most extreme Android phone to ever exist by a mile. Does it beat the iPhone? Is it finally time for me and other iPhone users to jump ship to Android? Spoiler alert, this is me getting into bed at 3 AM last night because one of these phones' batteries would not die during my battery test. So, starting with the unboxing experience, I can say with a high degree of confidence so far, yes. The phone comes packaged in what looks like an interplanetary object. This magnetic strap, by the way, is also a dock for the phone that launches an augmented reality video game, which is shockingly well fleshed out for what's basically just a party trick. I mean, these things are actual buttons that control your phone like a games console. There's an insert, which has a case inside of it. Cool design, but just shockingly little material here, considering the beastly size of the phone. You've got the charging brick, USB-C cable, a very sizable pouch, don't even think about it, editors, and that's made to carry the single most ridiculous phone accessory you've ever seen, the Aeroactive Cooler 7. And here's the phone, which, with a case this skimpy, kind of looks like you've just slipped a bodybuilder into a bikini. Now compare that to the unboxing experience of the iPhone 14 Pro Max. I guess they win on minimalism? But yeah, this point clearly goes to the ROG. 8 more tests to go. Let's see if the most extreme flagship phone on the planet can beat the most popular flagship phone on the planet. So then we've got audio. And to be honest, I've been super impressed with the speaker quality on the new iPhones. No one can argue that this is not one of the best sounding phones on the market, with a pretty powerful combination of its bottom firing speaker and then its earpiece speaker on the front. But, this is something else entirely. Last year's ROG Phone 6 already had the best phone speakers on the market, and they say they've now given the speaker units even more room to be able to move and therefore push more air, which should result in even boomier sound. Oh wow, okay. Instantly. You can probably hear this all the way to Apple Bar. Wow. It is insane how much better that is in the iPhone. It's louder, the bass is thumping, and the position of the speakers makes it feel like the sound's being fired directly into my ears. But then it just gets silly good when you use this. So this ROG company's been making coolers like this for generations now, and every time they release a new one, they add a key new feature to it. So at this point, we've got a kickstand, a headphone jack, physical buttons, LEDs, a portal that opens up on the phone to allow it to pump air directly over the chip itself. But this time round, it's also a subwoofer, or in other words, a third speaker designed specifically for bass. So just by locking it in like this, you hear the difference. It's adding a whole other layer of warmth and richness to the track. Don't know what else to say. Second point also goes to the ROG. But okay, fine. The unboxing experience, the audio experience, you could say they're still niche features. So, let's test what's arguably the most core, fundamental phone feature for all of us. The battery. So, we'll get both phones side by side. These are brand new versions of each phone, by the way, just to make sure they have 100% battery health. I've equalized brightness and put speaker volume at 50%, so let's see who wins. The plan is we're running straight YouTube videos for the first couple of hours. Okay, wow. The iPhone is actually a reasonable amount ahead, possibly because its display can automatically reduce its refresh rate to lower than the ROG phone can when not needed to save battery. I also reckon though at least some part of this is the fact that Apple's battery indicator does not tell you the truth. I'm pretty sure that iPhones hang on the first few percentage points just to reassure the user that their phone's not dropping as soon as they take it out of charge. So now, social media. We'll do Instagram and TikTok for another couple of hours. And after that, you can start to see the ROG pulling ahead. But what's really going to separate the men from the boys is some proper gaming. So we'll run some Genshin Impact, some Doom, and just basically keep these games on until the phones call it quits. Which, in the iPhone's case, gives us a total time of 9 hours and 30 minutes. I would say that is towards the upper end of modern flagships, but just not the best. Meanwhile, the ROG is still going. It's still at 37% for goodness sake. But slowly, surely, if we push it hard enough, it too eventually dies. But it took 12 hours and 18 minutes to get there, which frankly is insane. And yes, I stood around for 12 hours to get this result. So, you know, subscribe if you appreciate it. You won't regret it. I'm only half surprised by the result. I mean, this thing does have 2 separate 3,000 mAh batteries inside of it, so 6,000 mAh total, which is a lot more than this guy. It's just that because it's actually the lighter phone between the two, you forget how much is in there. But then I was like, well, the phones are down here anyway. They're both at 0% right now. We might as well also test how fast they can charge. And you see why I ended up sleeping at 3 AM now. So I plugged both in, using the original charging bricks and cables provided with them, which gives the ROG up to 65 watts of power. And the iPhone, well, technically 0 watts. It doesn't come with a charger.
But assuming you'll pay the extra $40 to get the fastest possible charging, this brick can deliver 27 watts of power to an iPhone 14 Pro.
The iPhone's definitely off to a faster start, which might sound strange, but is not actually unheard of, because that wattage figure, it doesn't tell you the full story. Because the number only tells you the maximum charging power the phone can reach, not the power that it can keep sustaining the charge at. So anyway, as soon as the ROG Phone kicks into gear, it very quickly equalizes, even slightly overtaking after just 10 minutes.
And something to think about is that the iPhone also has a far smaller battery capacity too, 4,300 mAh versus 6,000. So there's just less to fill up.
And so the fact that it's even close sends a very clear message that charging speed is not one of Apple's fortes. And yeah, if you look at the final times for the complete charge, ROG Phone slips in at 1 hour 7 minutes, while the iPhone still has a way to go. So that's another point to the ROG.
Now, you might well be thinking, well, of course the ROG Phone wins all of this. It's a $1,400 phone. But this thing comes with 512 gigabytes of storage by default. And if you go for 512 gigabytes on the iPhone, it's the same price as this in the US, and actually the much more expensive phone basically everywhere else. But surely the iPhone wins in the camera department, right? The camera is one of the reasons to buy an iPhone. Well, both phones have one camera on the front and then a triple camera on the back.
And there's probably not as much in it as you might expect. The ROG has more natural background blur when you're taking selfies. It's just as sharp in 98% of situations, extremely good at those difficult dynamic range situations, arguably better than the iPhone. Not to mention that it has the power to shoot full 4K slow motion, which is far beyond the 1080p that Apple can do.
But where the iPhone does pull ahead is intelligence.
It's the way it identifies and treats faces so that they're the center of attention. The way it uses all of its sensors to focus on subjects instantly, even for finicky, difficult objects that most phones would struggle with. Plus, just generally, the video. Video requires far more advanced processing to be able to pull off well than a simple photo. And this is where the years that Apple has spent refining really pays off. So that brings the score to 4-1. One thing that I think will be a really interesting experiment between these two is Wi-Fi speeds. Because on one hand, most of what the average user does on their phone is internet related, and so you would kind of expect the most popular flagship phone to have that internet aspect completely nailed down. But then again, this thing is all about shaving off milliseconds of lag when you're playing online competitive games. So who actually wins? All right, let's start with the iPhone. We'll do Google speed test. Wow, okay. It's not too shabby considering we're tucked into an attic. And just over 40 megabits up. Same thing for the ROG phone. Ooh. I mean, that is an absolutely enormous drop-off. That's really, really slow in comparison. But just to see if I could get a result that felt a little bit more reliable, I also ran the test 10 more times in a controlled environment, but there were actually no consistent trends. The ROG seems to have higher peak speeds, but the iPhone seems to have more consistent speeds, especially when it comes to upload. But there's enough variation that I'd say, call this one a draw. But what's even more important than a bit of slightly reduced latency here and there is how good everything actually looks on these screens. So they're both huge displays. The ROG is actually even slightly larger, but you probably wouldn't notice without a side-by-side. And they're both better in their own ways. So the ROG is technically a faster display. You know how phones have been dialing up from standard 60Hz to 90 and to now the 120Hz displays that we see on pretty much every 2023 flagship? Well, this thing has a 165Hz display. Proportionally, that should be nearly as big as the jump between 60 and a 90Hz display, which was huge. And yeah, if you scroll your home pages and record using a slow-mo camera, you will absolutely notice the difference. But my eyes are struggling to. It feels like one of those 50% more effort for 5% more gain type of situations. And to be honest, I think at this point, what makes more of a difference is the quality of animations, which Apple really does have nailed down. The ROG does also have a second display on the back, although I would say it's far less useful than the rear displays on most phones that have it. It doesn't let you preview the camera or check the contents of your notifications. It is almost exclusively just for those, hey, look what my phone can do moments. And then for the iPhone, we have a higher peak brightness, 2000 nits versus 1500, which basically covers you for those extra bright outdoor scenes or those extra dark TV shows. I'm looking at you, Game of Thrones and Ozark. It has LTPO tech, which is why it can lower its refresh rate all the way down to 1 Hz when not needed, which, as you've seen, does help it to save some battery. It has a slightly higher resolution and also symmetry. I'm fully aware that the reason this ROG phone has these top and bottom bezels is that people like something to grip onto when they're gaming, not to mention in order to fit these massive speakers in. But I am just too much of a sucker for things being aligned and neat. So for me, iPhone takes the best display award. But now it's time for the big question. performance. I don't know about you, but I definitely hear a lot about how Apple's Bionic chips lead the pack, how they're 2 years ahead of the competition in terms of power. I mean, Apple's actually reached the point where they've started releasing new phones using the previous year's chips, which if I've ever seen a sign that a company is comfortable that they're ahead, it's that. But then this thing is geared for performance. Performance is what these ROG phones are all about. So let's start with some benchmarks. Opening with Antutu, which is a very general test that looks at all aspects of your phone and gives you one number to summarize its performance. And for this, the ROG is coming out over 30% higher, which is ridiculous. That's more than a generational leap. Bear in mind, I have attached the Aeroactive cooler onto it, which can apparently cool its surface by up to 25 degrees Celsius, and so will naturally improve its performance. And yeah, that's not completely fair to the iPhone, because that's not being cooled by anything. But then again, the cooler did come in the box, so I feel like it would probably be more unfair to not use it. So then we've got GFX Bench, which is going to focus solely on graphics. The entire reason we even need to run multiple benchmarks, by the way, is that while we all do love the idea of just one number that summarizes all performance, actually comparing numbers between Android and iOS is a bit weird, because even the benchmarking apps themselves are two different apps built on two different lines of code. That said, if we take multiple tests and we see consistent trends, that should be enough for us to make a conclusion. And it's going pretty well so far for the ROG, with it finishing this test with almost double the performance. What? But then with Geekbench, which focuses on the CPU, the iPhone is ahead, and not really by a small margin. So to get to the bottom of it, we're just going to run benchmark after benchmark after benchmark, until now, where I have a result I'm confident in. So essentially, Apple still has the lead when it comes to CPU, and no amount of cooling or overclocking on the ROG's end can make up for that gap. But top-level Android phones currently have a better GPU for gaming, especially helped by this cooling, not to mention faster memory too, so anything that looks at overall system performance is going to rank this phone higher, which really makes the category a draw overall. But it's one thing to have these theoretical numbers. What about the games themselves? Because something I've definitely been told multiple times is how games on iPhone are just more optimized on average than games on Android. And so the numbers don't tell the full story. So here's my favorite. This is Bloons Tower Defense 6. And it's going to allow us to basically cover the screen in enemy balloons, creating vast amounts of particles on screen, as well as damage calculations that need to be made to see which phone starts to lag first. Okay, so let's start by sending 999 medium strength enemies on screen. So right now this is performing millions of calculations per second. You can see a little bit of lag just there, starting to drop a few frames, but it's definitely still playable. So let's see what happens if we send in 999 of the strongest enemy. Yeah, okay, you can see it start to chug. You can only be impressed by how much is actually happening on screen at one time. Right, time to see what this ROG is made of. You can instantly tell the saturation of the screen is way higher. Let's try the medium enemies. I think it's either about the same or slightly better. But yeah, you can tell it's not running at its maximum frame rate. Let's try the big boys. I think this is actually slower than the iPhone. There's more lag here. So it could be the iPhone's better CPU helping out with all these calculations, or potentially just the app being less optimized on Android. So this is not a bad result by any stretch of the imagination, but it is kind of funny in that you got this whole gamer phone where every single decision about it has been designed with games in mind. You got a cooler that's half the size of my face, and yet the end result is not dissimilar from a phone that just looks like it's not even trying. Which is enough for me to say, this is a really great phone for someone who's already an Android user, but just not quite enough to warrant an entire shift in ecosystem.
But whatever phone you decide to use in the end, if you want to make the most of it, this is why I strongly recommend Surfshark VPN. See, every single time you connect to the internet, your personal information is being shared with not just your network owner, but every company whose website you visit. And there's a whole load of situations where you don't want that to happen. Like, it's a pretty common thing for criminals to set up free open public Wi-Fi spots for the sole purpose of collecting people's data. With a VPN though, your data goes through a server before reaching the other parties. And the goal of the server is to basically scramble your details to make you anonymous. As for why I recommend Surfshark particularly, well, the app is really robust. I've used a lot of shoddy VPN apps. This is not one of them. You get a ton of extra privacy features included with it, and also it's stupidly cheap, which just give you that peace of mind that you're being looked after. Using the code BOSS, you end up at less than $3 a month, which, because that can cover multiple users, per person can end up as literally cents.